From Acres USA, you are listening to the Acres USA podcast, a conversational podcast where we'll explore sustainable farming, regenerative practices, and the latest innovations in eco-agriculture with some of your favorite farmers and ranchers. I'm your host, Taylor Henry, the owner and CEO of Acres USA. Welcome to the Acres USA podcast. Alrighty, I am joined here with Kevin Wolz of Canopy. Kevin has been working with Canopy for a while, and Canopy is one of a new company or newer company that we're excited about working with. They're pretty local to us here in Wisconsin. You guys are located in Spring Green, Wisconsin. But Kevin, if you kind of want to give a little bit of introduction about yourself, and then do a little introduction about Canopy itself.
Yeah. So my name is Kevin Wolz. I kind of came to ag, not raised on a farm. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago and originally was passionate about ecological restoration, prairies and savannas of Illinois and Wisconsin, and dove into all that. But then when I went to school in Illinois in the heart of the Corn Belt, there was no starting point. There was no nature to restore. It was very jarring for me. So I felt like there had to be some way that we could merge these worlds of agriculture and restoration and try to kill two birds with one stone kind of thing. Why do we have to just be hyper-focused on one or the other extreme? And so ultimately that led me to regenerative ag, agroforestry especially, and just this opened up this whole rabbit hole for me. So I dove into that initially, mostly through academia, doing research in Illinois. But then ultimately we founded the Savannah Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that does research and education and plant breeding and all kinds of things that you might expect a nonprofit to do, but very focused on agroforestry and very focused in the Midwest. And so SI now has been around for a little over 10 years, and we're doing all kinds of stuff to really push agroforestry along, to push along the industry, tree crops as well. And then recently we started Canopy as a for-profit kind of spin-off from the Institute. At the end of the day, the nonprofit does a lot of important work, but agriculture is a for-profit thing, is a for-profit enterprise. And so there are a lot of roles and things that need to happen in this space that need to be driven by for-profit companies. And so we realized that was a big bottleneck that needed to be filled, was to have a company that was filling that space, providing tree planting and management services, big bottlenecks in the nursery space as well. We've got to have our own nursery. And so that was kind of what prompted the launch of Canopy, was to free up some of these chicken or egg issues, bottleneck issues that were holding back the industry generally, that, you can do research all day long, but at the end of the day, someone has to put the trees in the ground and do that well and effectively.
What is your role then? So you founded Savannah Institute? And then
way back when.
And then you started Canopy as well? So Savannah Institute's been around for a long time. I remember looking into your guys' organization when I was buying my farm. Do you want to explain a little bit? Because you help with funding to start farms or kind of get the initial infrastructure in place. Do you want to describe kind of what you guys have, what you started Savannah Institute for, and what the purpose of it is?
Sure. Yeah. So the Savannah Institute is primarily a research and education organization. So you have a whole team of scientists that are doing research on tree crops and agroforestry practices, from plant breeding, improving the trees themselves, all the way to getting a better understanding of carbon and other climate impacts, biodiversity impacts, cropping systems, optimization, kind of the full range of research questions. And then on the education side, we want to teach everyone. There's a lot of education that needs to happen across the board, not just with farmers. So we do have farmer training and apprenticeship programs, but we're also educating other people in the supply chain, whether that be eaters or companies that are making food products from agroforestry systems or tree crops, or even investors that want to plug in and help make things happen, but don't understand exactly how like what's needed. And so the education is kind of the full range of things there. Um, yeah. So in terms of helping new farms get started, SI has its own kind of array of demonstration farms, we call them, in Illinois and Wisconsin, that are SI managed farms and kind of help show people what's possible at a larger scale. And then from there, we have kind of a network of partner farms that's a growing network that people can join to kind of be part of this group to get information and be plugged in.
Nice. Well, I guess I heard about Savannah Institute might have been one of the first things that I stumbled upon when I got into regenerative agriculture. And so
Yeah.
what was your first introduction to regenerative ag? Did you learn about it in college, or you kind of just self-taught?
Well, that's an easy answer. That Mark Shepard is my first exposure
Oh,
to this
nice.
whole world, really. So I was in school trying to figure out where agriculture and restoration meet in the middle, and came up here to Wisconsin, and someone told me, "Have you met Mark Shepard? You should go meet him. Like this is the guy you got to talk to." And so I went out to at that time the Moses conference. This was in 2009, I think, and just like tracked down Mark at this conference, and he was, as Mark is, just moving at a million miles an hour, going between all these different things, talking to everyone. Um, he was doing a cider tasting. He had a top hat on and like a really nice, like almost like a tux type thing. It's a really kind of surreal first meeting with Mark.
I've seen
Um,
that. I think he has a billboard or old poster in his office that has that.
yeah.
Yeah, so I can picture what he looked like there.
Not what I was expecting to meet a farmer for the first time, top hat. Um, but yeah, and just dove in with Mark and just asked him a million questions, hung out on his farm, and yeah, it just really soaked it all up. And then after that, only then realized that there was this word agroforestry, which is the USDA's preferred, word for this thing, or I guess more broadly, academia's preferred word for this suite of practices. And then really tried to explore that. How does the USDA play into all this? What's the history here with the Dust Bowl and all kinds of stuff going? And yeah, so but definitely started with Mark.
That's funny. We have very similar beginnings then. Mark Restoration Ag was my second book that I read, and I realized Mark was 20 minutes from me, so I went and did a similar thing. I think I drove by his farm probably 25 times while I was listening to his book on audio, trying to like, because it was, I was reading all these books and doing research, but it was rare to be able to actually like physically see what they were talking about in the books. And then finally I just went up and knocked on the door, and Mark and I have been working together since then. He's the main reason I found my way into acres as well. So,
Yeah.
um, so you have a good understanding of Mark's farm, so you'll know, when we talk about how we graze it, you actually have firsthand experience having boots on the ground there. That's cool.
Yeah, it's a beautiful place. I love walking around there.
Yeah, I say it's 27 years or 30 years ahead of my place. So we have all these between the oldest trees we have are 4 years old, and then we did another big planting of 2,500 plus trees this spring, and it's tough to look at those things when they're young and try to
Yeah.
imagine what they are, but I get a good perspective going down there, and all the shade that they provide and the extra forage and food that we get. I think mostly in the fall, but um, and the cattle do a great job of kind of pruning and trimming up the bottoms of those trees. So um, I guess
Yeah.
what was your first aha moment with agroforestry that made you kind of find this as your main lane?
Well, I don't have any experience with livestock. I'm always the first to admit it. But, growing up in the suburbs, that was it. I
Hey,
had a few
I
backyard
grew up
chickens in my life.
I grew up a city boy as well. So
Yeah. One day I'll get into cattle. I had a few backyard chickens. That's my extent.
yeah,
So the from the suite of agroforestry practices, the practice that I have really most fallen in love with over the years is alley cropping.
Hmm.
Different names for it too, but that's what the USDA uses. Um, and so for people that aren't familiar with alley cropping, it's basically widely spaced rows of trees, and you keep growing row crops in between, or something, usually row crops, in between in the quote unquote alleys. And those alleys can be a variety of widths. It really depends on the equipment that the farmer has. So oftentimes we're designing alley widths to be, for example, 2 times the width of whatever your widest equipment is. Maybe that's your combine, maybe that's your sprayer, depends on the farmer. So down in central Illinois, there basically aren't any livestock anywhere. And there's no pasture, there's no hay. And so that was the system that in central Illinois was really learning about agriculture, that I saw just huge relevance to, huge applicability to so many places. And I did my postdoc in France studying alley cropping systems and seeing how they do it in Europe, and seeing how much they've thought through optimizing those systems, which tree species to mix with which crops, and how they complement each other in terms of phenology or nutrient requirements. It's just, yeah, really incredible. So the data coming out of those systems in different parts of the world and showing how efficient they can be, and quote unquote over yielding is this phrase that you can get more value or calories per acre when you mix trees and crops rather than keeping them on separate acres. And once originally trained as an engineer, so once you start telling me that we can like really hone efficiency and get these over yielding things, I was hooked. Like, this is okay. Let's figure out how to really do this well.
I always say the engineer mind seems to transition to agriculture really well. You are not alone in
Yeah.
that, especially all you guys doing agroforestry. It seems like everybody's into engineering. That was like,
Yeah. Mark, I think, was a mechanical engineer originally
yeah,
too.
yeah,
Yeah.
he's definitely one of them that follow that as well. So
Real engineers.
how do you are you as serious as Mark when it comes to the initial setup of a design? Are you getting into the water management, water design, key line designs? Kind of describe how what's your guys' first step when you step on um, a bare cornfield or bean field?
Yeah. That's a great question. Cause we do, most often people come to Canopy not having a design or a plan. They
Right.
mostly come to us wanting our help in terms of establishment and management services. But the first step is, what's the plan? What's the design? And usually they need help with that. They don't. Some people come with a plan from that they made themselves or from someone else. We review it really quick, make sure we don't see any red flags, and then we can go forward. But yeah, usually there's a planning stage here and a design phase. We don't do a ton of waterworks, mostly because the areas we're working in, for example, in Illinois or outside of the driftless, there's not much topography. It's like some
Yep.
farms that we planted in Illinois, there's like 6 inches between the highest and the lowest point. So there's not much you can do with that. We do typically install, if we're doing tree crops, like not in conservation focused plantings, but in tree crop plantings that we're really going for production, we typically do install irrigation, drip irrigation along the tree rows or the shrub rows. But yeah, I mean, I think it really first starts before we even set foot on a site. So this is where this Canopy Compass tool that we recently launched really comes into play, because as a consultant that's working with people kind of scattered all over the place, we can't make the first step showing up on the farm. We try to have as much interaction virtually as possible first to save everyone time and, burning diesel, driving back and forth. And so the first step for us is running a farm through Canopy Compass. So Canopy Compass is this new website where there's two components to it. The first is this online mapping platform. You can go onto Canopy Compass for free and look at all kinds of maps on soil data, really high resolution, climate data. And then the kind of bread and butter of Canopy Compass are these crop suitability maps. These crop suitability maps tell you, based on a whole array of criteria for every given crop, based on what they need in soil and climate, where it's suitable to grow these and where it's ideal or where it's unsuitable. And so the algorithm and the data behind all these suitability layers in Canopy Compass comes from the Savannah Institute, comes from the team of PhD scientists at the Savannah Institute developing all this, really scouring the literature, asking experts, building these really great models. And then we put that out here for people to look at. And so the first step is to run that. And the second part of Canopy Compass that you get when you run something is you get this report. You get a PDF report that shows you not just some pretty pictures or maps with lots of colors, which can be kind of overwhelming, but also helps you interpret that, gives you some context, gives you some kind of walks you through the data to make sure that it's not super overwhelming, explains what all the colors mean, explains how you should interpret things, what's really behind some of the data, how much to trust certain things or what you need to validate on the ground, all of that stuff. And so the first step we do is we run every farm through Canopy Compass. That tells us right out of the gate what kind of the higher level bounds are. We understand the climate constraints. We understand the soil constraints. Are we dealing with just 1 foot of soil and bedrock, or is there more to work with? That's going to dramatically change what we can do. And usually we don't need to go, the soil data is really quite accurate. We don't need to go onto a farm to know that kind of extreme data. We always wanted ground truth, of course, once we really get into the nitty gritty. But the real kind of big bounds we can get pretty well with this government data and satellite imagery. And it's really important to do this too, because oftentimes, for better or for worse, people are coming to us with a crop in mind, 1 or 2 crops in mind. So right now, you guys just had a couple issues ago, I think it was a feature on chestnuts, and chestnuts are kind of all the rage right now. Everyone wants to plant chestnuts. So we get people that come to us saying, I want to plant chestnuts. Here's my farm. I'm ready to go. Let's do it. And then we run their farm through Canopy Compass. And if Canopy Compass returns unsuitable for chestnuts because, it's too wet or not enough soil or, whatever it is, we have to have this hard conversation about, I'm sorry, but your farm just really isn't suited for that. So do you have another place on your farm or a different parcel? Or maybe let's talk about some of these other crops that are more suited for your particular context. So a lot of those initial conversations we can have virtually, and then we go on the ground to ground truth. And we have a whole suite of high resolution soil measurement stuff that we can ground truth a lot of this afterwards.
So I'm actually pulling up the mapping software right now. This must have been quite the process to develop this. How long have you guys been working on this?
3 years.
Yeah. Has
It's
it been
been,
has it been fun?
yes. I mean, yeah, it's taken a lot. I mean, we could have forced something, pushed something out in the world earlier, but as us geeky scientists like to do, we really wanted to make sure that it was accurate and not giving people bad information. And, there's a ton of data out there, but you need to, yeah, it's not all perfect. You need to really clean it. You need to really make sure that you're weeding out some of the weird stuff. And so took a lot of time to do that, to build the algorithms, to run the suitability analysis, and to really scour the literature for those criteria. When we have a crop suitability map for apple, for example, that's based on a database of what apple likes. What soil pH does it like? What winter minimum temperature can it handle? How hot can it get before it gets too upset? And so there's this whole database of data behind these maps that then you run against all the high resolution soil and climate data to get these maps out the other end. So it's also very computationally expensive and intensive. So it took a long time to really run everything and get these maps easy for people to see.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I am kind of a map nerd myself. I like to draw out lots of different, for us, all of our paddocks and kind of the designs and how we're going to move things. So I'm always very impressed with any type of mapping software that's actually usable, because I think in the agricultural industry, I haven't seen very many.
Yeah.
And this looks like I did it right there. It was like 2 minutes and I could have got a report.
Yeah. Yeah, we spend a lot of time trying to do that because I agree. There's so many maps out there, especially government ones that like have really great intentions, but then just put way too many buttons in your face, and you're
Yeah.
just so overwhelmed by what do I click next?
Yeah, I use, Onyx, which is actually meant for hunting, but it's the only mapping software that I've actually used that is, high quality to where you can draw out fields and paddocks and
Yeah,
different shapes. Um, so someone comes to you and you guys generate that report. It's an amazing, um, I think, front end introduction to somebody for them to actually get something like that. What's like the core species that you guys are working with right now that you'd recommend for most people? I know each place is different, but
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, so it depends on what your primary goals are. So we lump all of our jobs into kind of two really broad categories. One category is the kind of conservation first jobs. The other is revenue first or yield first. You can put it a different way. So most most practices, most systems, most jobs have both of those goals very much embedded into the project. But usually people come where one is more important than the other. And so for conservation first jobs, that's something more like windbreaks or riparian buffers or things, that are kind of on the edges of farms. And those are really good kind of baby steps into trees and agroforestry, keeps things on the edge. You can keep doing row crops in the middle and get the farmer kind of weaned back onto trees. Um, and so in those kinds of systems, we generally plant mostly native species. We usually try to do pretty high diversity to keep, we don't want to plant all one species and that's be the next thing that gets the bug. Um, but often we're planting improved varieties of native species. So, if we're going to put elderberry in a riparian buffer, we'll include improved varieties of elderberry or things like that. So there's at least still some scavenging potential that a family can do off of even a conservation first planting like that. And then on the revenue first side, this is mostly tree crops that people want to actually grow for yield, for profit. Um, and those systems are usually still diverse. Multiple species are being included, but there's usually more of a focus, less than a conservation first job. And I would say right now, the most common species that people are interested in and actually have markets for, that's a really important piece too.
yeah.
You could be really interested in a crop and there's no market, then you don't have anything. Uh, so I think the most common right now are definitely chestnut, hazelnut, uh, blackcurrant. We do a lot with. I'm pretty obsessed with blackcurrant as an early yielding, early revenue berry crop. Those are the big three. Persimmon and pawpaw are becoming more common. Persimmon already is pretty popular for silvopasture, but it's also becoming more popular for pulp as well. And all of those species we uh, grow in our nursery here in Spring Green. We do bare root for the most part. We do some things potted. Pawpaw, for example, really prefer potted, being transplanted that way. We don't do any hazelnut yet. We have a lot of great nurseries that do hazelnut already, so we're just trying to fill in the gaps where there's lack of capacity. So yeah, a lot of those tree crops are really focused in our nursery, and then the wild stock we get from nurseries all over the Midwest. There's a lot of really great nurseries already out there that grow wild genetics, whether it be like the local DNR nurseries or private nurseries elsewhere.
We'll talk about chestnuts because I think that is one of the most popular ones. That's what we were just talking about. That's what I got really excited about after reading Mark's book. Um, how do you guys, or what breed are you using? And then obviously that changes with which zone someone's in. So which breeds of chestnut are you using?
Yeah, so we almost exclusively use Chinese chestnuts. As you get, I mean, basically north of the Illinois-Wisconsin border, then you have to go hybrid
Yeah.
of some degree, which can mean a lot of things. But most of the stuff we're doing is south of that border, and so it's mostly Chinese. But we're mostly working with half sib or full sib seedlings, and Although we're experimenting a little bit in some further south areas with grafted Chinese chestnuts, and also tissue culture Chinese chestnuts is becoming a thing suddenly in the industry, which is pretty
And
cool.
how would you describe that? What, I guess, describe that for.
Yeah. So these are, most tree crops in the world are grown clonally, so either grafted or tissue culture. So every tree in the orchard is the same exact genotype. There are just as many pros as there are cons to that approach. But it's something to explore and potentially be part of the, part of the farm kind of equation. I don't think you ever want to put all your eggs in the clonal basket. Yeah, but for the most part, we're working with Chinese seedlings from improved parents. All the Chinese chestnuts that come out of our nursery seedlings are seed from mother trees that are on older farms that are high performing individuals. So for example, Redfern Farm or Wintergreen or Route 9, they all know what their top trees are, and they can round up seed from those, and then we grow those out in the nursery. And like I said, mostly bare root. We find that bare root at scale performs a lot better, is easier to plant, especially mechanically with a tree planter, and also is cheaper. It's cheaper to grow, cheaper to buy, cheaper to transport. Potted works better if you are operating on a smaller scale and you're not as familiar with tree planting. It's harder to mess up when you're planting a potted tree. So we still grow potted for people that are smaller orders, but bare root is really the scaled up approach.
Yeah. Do you want to give people a little bit of background why we use Chinese chestnuts these days, and we can't, or we don't use the American, and what a hybrid is?
Yeah. This is a whole.
I know we could go down a really long
Yeah,
rabbit hole on
I'll keep
the
it short.
American. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would assume
So
most people listening kind of know most of the background, but.
Yeah. So American chestnut, which was native to this continent, early 1900s, 1910, somewhere in there, this disease came over, and chestnut blight, the fungus, and basically killed all within a matter of like.
And those were like giant, like 100-plus-year-old,
trees.
100
Yeah.
feet tall monsters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is like the dominant tree in the eastern U.S. and cornerstone of the ecosystem, dropping food for the whole thing.
Yeah.
So they were gone, and there are initiatives working on breeding resistance into American chestnut. This has been going on for a long time. It is really, really important work, but it's a long game. It really is. And even if that is successful, that's still the application there is mostly for reforestation efforts and timber efforts, because that's the American chestnut's really good at. The American chestnut nut is pretty small and doesn't taste as great for like culinary uses. The Chinese chestnut is a smaller, broader tree, and has really great nut quality, is immune to chestnut blight, and so is the kind of perfect tree for actual nut production. There are other species out there, Japanese, European species of chestnut. In Michigan, the industry up there is using mostly hybrids of some of those other species, which have some benefits to them. They graft better and are larger nuts usually, but they're not resistant to chestnut blight.
Yeah.
So we see a lot of farms starting to get blight, and that usually doesn't end well.
And the issue with
really
with Chinese when you get into our area is they aren't as cold tolerant.
Yes, yeah, that's the downfall.
But it's usually like what, like
Chinese
negative
chestnut.
30. If you get like a stretch of like negative 30, that's kind of like the cutoff.
Yeah, and you know what we've seen even just a couple years ago, actually in 2019, we had a really horrible year for Chinese chestnuts in the Midwest, and it was this like 1-2 punch. It rained a lot in the winter, and the ground was totally saturated. This was in Iowa and Illinois, at least. And then once the ground was totally saturated, we had this polar vortex come through and
Mhm.
freeze everything totally solid. And that was a recipe for really killing a bunch of trees. And unfortunately, like, that kind of thing is going to become more common here with climate change. And so our kind of standard metric of, how cold does it get in the winter is just a part of the equation here moving forward. Like, we also have to be cognizant of these really weird wet winters and polar vortices. And it's just, yeah, got to be careful.
Yeah. And did you guys have a really good winter last year? Because even in our area in southern Wisconsin, we barely ever even had a inch of
Yeah.
frost in the ground. Is that good or is that bad for them?
It's fine for the trees. What it's not great for is pests.
Yeah.
So when you don't have really cold winters, more pests survive the winter, and so you'll see larger populations, larger outbreaks of that. So it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah. How do you I guess what's your position on I'm sure each client is different, but what is planting volume? So would you rather, one of the big questions always is would you rather plant higher volume with less say tubes? Because I think a lot of people, I've gone through that as well where it's like I could buy 2 or 3 extra trees versus buying 1 tree in a tube and then
Yeah.
planting them closer together. And that a lot of that came from Mark for sure, just the stun method, even though his place has tubes on some and he does irrigate too, different times. But our first round of planting trees we planted in tubes. I actually had tubes kill a lot of trees because they ended up being maybe the stakes weren't tall enough,
Mm,
but those tubes
mm,
would bend over and snap in the wind. And, I lost some the first year, but it was actually more worse when it was like the second and third year where those trees actually became a little bit more mature and those tubes would snap and they would actually snap the tree. Um, I'm sure we just needed a taller stake to help that. But this year when we got a load of, 2,500 chestnuts and mainly chestnuts, we haven't used tubes. And I'll be curious to see what the difference is. But
yeah.
how do you look
Always
at that?
great. It's always great to do side by side. I
Yeah.
do that in some of my own farms. I've done side by side, and you can see what happens. And yeah, I'd say that the first thing
Well, and
in
actually
analyze,
mice cause problems in tubes too.
yeah, for sure. The first thing to ask when evaluating this question is there deer pressure?
Yeah.
Usually the answer is yes. But if you are lucky enough to be in the corn desert of central Illinois, not near a tree for miles, the answer might be no, which is nice. We have a couple farms like that where there's just, I mean, there are no animals of any
Mhm.
size. So that's an interestingly positive situation to be in some ways. Um, but yeah, usually there's deer pressure. Usually there's rabbit pressure. And so yeah. So at the end of the day, for us, it really comes down to the value of the tree, the cost of the tree that you put in originally, and how often you're expecting to be there or that you're able to be there. So as the tree gets more expensive, which usually means, improved genetics, tree crop type stuff, the equation for putting the tree on the tube tips towards it is cheaper to put the tube on and not have to go replant that tree. It's
Yeah.
not just the cost of the tree, it's going out like when we plant initially, we're mechanically planting with a tree planter and we can plant 10, 12,000 trees a day. And that's really efficient. When you're going out and replacing mortality that's scattered throughout a row, that's by hand. And
Mhm.
that's just way more expensive, way more time consuming. That's a horrible job. And so you have to factor that in as well. It's the cost of the tree and this kind of opportunity cost of all this extra planting. And so, yeah, so in general, for tree crops that are higher value, we use tree tubes on everything. For the conservation first stuff, windbreaks, riparian buffers, sometimes we use tree tubes, especially if it's if it's not somewhere where a landowner lives. It's just kind of more remote, hard to get to. They're not anticipating going out there very regularly or mowing they want it to be just kind of one and done. And they want to not argue with the government about the survival rate because that's what your cost share is dependent on. So we'll use it in those contexts. But yeah, often like you're saying, we'll just double, triple density and you either have thinned planting or the deer do it for you.
Yeah. So do you think there's a genetic makeup on whether or not a deer pressures or browses on a certain tree? Like, so when I go out and look at our trees, the ones that are, further back and closer to where the deer are obviously browsed a
Yeah.
lot more, but you'll notice, a couple here and there like aren't browsed as much. Is that some sort of genetic thing expressing itself that you could like, oh, I want to get those
Yeah.
nuts off that tree and plant them.
Yeah. I haven't seen that in chestnut per se or hardwoods generally. I don't know if there's like enough diversity there to really skew that, but I've seen it in other things. So willow, for example, deer love willow.
Hmm.
I mean, willow's a big silvopasture species generally. Livestock love willow generally. But on one of my farms, I have like 80 cultivars of willow all side by side, right in a big block. And it's incredible. Those deer will go down, they'll start in the first row and they'll like eat all 25 plants from cultivar number 1, and then they'll skip number 2, skip number 3, and then go to number 4. And like they're just going through that block and they know exactly which ones they like and they skip the rest. And
That's
so
weird.
they know. It's incredible.
That is crazy. Well, I mean, it's not surprising. They make a living out there eating things that are
Right.
good for them and not killing them. Um,
Yeah.
Also another thing I've noticed is so if I were we do have a bunch of tubes, so I think we're gonna go around and start putting some tubes on the ones that are doing well.
Mhm.
But in our pasture setting where we actually have high tensile 3 or 5 line, um, we don't see as much deer pressure in there, obviously, because we're in there a
Sure.
lot, the cattle are in there a lot. So it does seem like those trees are doing, a lot better than the ones that are in, more of what we call our nature area that,
Yeah.
we only graze, once or twice a year.
Yeah. No, I definitely. I mean, again, it's still a pasture. Like you have the pro of that, less deer pressure, but then you have to think about. I mean, cattle may not like try to eat the trees, but they'll lay on them or they'll rip off the tubes for fun
Yeah, so
sometimes. I've seen that.
ours are planted along paddock lines.
Yeah,
So we'll
that's
have a poly line, whichever paddock they're in, we move the poly line to the inside of the trees, and then when they
yeah,
rotate, say get up to the upper side, we just pop the line back
so
over.
sad.
It's easy now because they're short. It'll probably be a little bit more of a hassle,
Yeah, gotta
in the
roll it up with
future.
something.
But one of the issues I noticed with that too is if those lines are hot, I did notice a couple trees, if the line's touching the tree, they don't necessarily like the electricity either.
Yeah, no, yeah, they get electrocuted just like us.
Yeah, yeah. So I ended up kind of just shutting off those lines. Luckily, they're internal lines, and as long as the cattle are trained well, then they still respect
Sure.
it. But yeah, it's been an interesting experiment. I'm hoping we have a little bit more success than our first round of plantings. Um, so would you say chestnut's probably a good one to use as an example? I think the university system says plant them 30 feet apart.
Mm.
What is your kind of planting rules on chestnuts?
Yeah, I think it varies by latitude for sure. As you go further south, the trees are gonna, their end point will be bigger. They'll grow faster as well. Um, but in general, I mean, if you're talking monoculture chestnuts, we're often doing 20 by 20. So you get, higher yields there initially. And then, but then you're going to have to do thinning earlier than if you're doing it 30 by 30.
Hmm.
Um, if we're planting up in Wisconsin and we're using hybrids and we're not sure how many will survive, we'll go denser. Um, usually not denser between row because you got to make sure you're getting equipment down there, but within row, we'll go 10, 15 feet. This way, over the first 10 years, you can really see what works and what doesn't, what survives. Um, but regardless of the spacing you pick, the most important thing is thinning. It is so hard for people to thin. They love their trees, these trees they planted themselves, they've babied all these years. And I get it. It's hard to kill a tree. It doesn't feel great, but chestnuts, you really have to thin them because the nuts are on the outer edge of the canopy. As the trees start growing together, your yield is going to start plummeting, and they won't put branches back down there later. So like once they run together, you've kind of screwed that tree, even if you go back and thin a couple years late. So it's really important to thin probably earlier than you think you should. Otherwise you could really impact your yields in the long run.
What's what's kind of the years that you would expect? Like, what's your first thinning? 3 to 5 years?
Well, it depends on spacing. No, I
Yeah.
mean, you're talking like 10 years in, even
Yeah,
if
so
you're
we
thinning
actually
pretty tight.
spaced ours at 6 feet. So,
Okay, well, you'll be sooner than
yeah,
that.
like 5. I'm
If they all
expecting, like,
survive,
I'm expecting 3 to, yeah. I'm assuming a lot of them will just self-thin,
for
but
sure.
then,
Yeah.
um, yeah. So what's the management? The first couple of years, obviously, they're sensitive. It's important. You mentioned the drip irrigation. What have you seen, with your clients? I'm sure there's clients that say, "Hey, let's do it all. Let's make sure that these things survive." They go the whole, distance with it. But for people, what is at least some of the main keys of management in those first few years to get those trees started off on the right side?
Yeah. Yeah. Those first 3 to 5 years are really important. Once trees get established, it's true. Like they can really fend for themselves and they can put up with a lot of stuff. Um, but those first 3 to 5 years, they do need some TLC. When you think about it, an oak tree in the middle of a forest, yeah, that thing can hold its own now. But when it drops all those acorns, a million acorns coming off a tree, how many of those are actually going to survive after the first 3 years, out in the wild per se? So you have to be, if you really want to get trees to get successful, our philosophy really is the first 3 to 5 years is really to focus on the TLC, keep them happy. And after that, they really can do quite a bit themselves. So management goes a lot of different ways depending on if people are living. We work with a lot of absentee landowners or
Mhm.
non-operating landowners, and so we approach that very differently from someone who's an operating farmer or living on the farm. Um, and so we do a range of management. Uh, if the farmer or landowner wants to do the management themselves, we're always setting up, widths for mowing and everything so that they can manage it themselves. You have to really know what their equipment is before you start putting any pen to paper, because if you design it in a way that they can't use their own equipment, then they're just kind of screwed out of the gate.
Yeah.
So that's really important. Mowing is really important. Keeping this kind of weed-free zone in about a 2-foot minimum radius around a tree is really important in those first couple of years. But we also, for clients that are, and this is usually the tree crop focused clients that want to do, for us to do management, we offer kind of a full suite of management services. So we can just come out and plant trees for people, and then that's it. We don't talk anymore, and you guys they manage it themselves. Or we establish farms and then can also do management for people. That can be one-off things. It can be, usually people will mow themselves. They have a mower, they like mowing. But if it's certain specific things that require extra, like fancy equipment or just something that they don't have time to do, we can do one-off management, kind of a la carte things for people, or we can do full service. And so usually it's more institutional clients that want that. Just they want to, get one bill at the end of the year. We do everything from start to finish, manage the farm completely, and get the farm, moving towards bearing and yielding.
What's
We
some of
free.
the unique equipment that you guys have that you have in your arsenal that most folks wouldn't have?
Yeah, a lot of fun stuff. Well, I think the most unique things are the harvesters. So, like for example, the black currant harvester, the berry harvester is this beautiful piece of Polish engineering. It's just the most gorgeous machine ever, and it works incredibly well. But that's, it's a really expensive piece of machinery, and it doesn't make sense for every farmer to own one of those, like we can put it on a trailer, we can move around, we can rotate through farms, and we can really reduce costs for the whole ecosystem here in doing it that way. Like the harvesters are really a big one. Even things as simple as a mower. So we've got this really cool flail mower that Mows. So our current rows are 12 foot apart. We've got 8 foot of ground cover and then 2 foot on either side of mulch or bare ground. And so we got this flail mower that's 8 feet wide. It'll mow the ground cover you have there in the middle. And then it's got a conveyor belt behind that. And right away it just conveyors that what you just cut right into the rows and mulches the rows. It's just yeah, I love it. We're still working on kind of optimizing that, how much to fluff out that kind of conveyored mulch in the tree row. But even something as simple as a mower, you can really do some incredible things with. And mulching, growing our mulch on site and getting it into the rows is really a big theme for us because, again, for example, in central Illinois, there are no trees. We're in the middle of corn and soybeans. If there are no trees, there's no wood chips. So you can't plan on, I'm going to mulch my whole farm with wood chips. There are no wood chips. And so we really focus on growing our own mulch in place and moving it into the tree rows right then and there.
What is that mower that does that?
Gosh, I don't remember the brand. There's a couple out there. Some of them stopped making it. It's all from Europe.
Yeah.
There's nothing here domestically. There's a couple European brands. I think this one's Italian. But yeah, if you're looking for weird equipment like that, it's all in Europe, and you got to find the importer that's here in the US to get it over.
Yeah. That's half the battle of some of this equipment.
Yeah.
Okay, so they get to the point of where they actually can start harvesting. Let's talk about markets.
Hmm.
How do you help your clients get set up with different markets? So we've been talking about chestnut. What is let's start with that. What is the go-to chestnut market? What is it used for? How do people sell it? How do people harvest it?
Yeah. Well, most people are harvesting right now with nut wizards, to be honest. The people at a smaller scale or trees are just starting to bear a little bit. That's the main approach. As people get bigger, some people say, 5 acres or so is the tipping point where it becomes economically feasible or better to actually get a harvester, tractor pulled harvester. Yeah. So we want everyone to, priority is finding your own kind of local fresh market, whether that be in your own city near you or through the various co-ops that exist already, Prairie Grove and in Iowa, Chestnut Growers Inc. in Michigan, Route 9 in Ohio. Like if you can find your regional co-op and sell there, that's going to be your best bet. That's fresh nuts is your top dollar price that you're going to get for your nuts. So if you can sell into that, that's the best opportunity. As we have more clients that are going to start reaching kind of yielding in their bearing years, we will start aggregating ourselves as well. So we'll get a harvester. We can aggregate. We've got a big walk-in cooler at our shop because we have, we're storing nursery plants over the winter and we are storing trees we buy in and getting ready for planting in the spring. But at the fall, the cooler's just sitting there empty. And so it's the perfect timing to bring in nuts in the fall. And so we can kind of synergize with infrastructure at different times a year. So ultimately, for clients that we do full service management for, we will buy and aggregate all the crop.
Oh, that's cool. So that's an amazing offer that you have. The people that work with you then have a way to sell it, and they all sell it through you.
Try to
That's
keep it
really
simple.
cool. Yeah, that's the no-brainer. So, the economics behind it. Someone has a corn and bean field that say they get 100% yield out of it without tree rows in it. What percentage are they giving up by putting rows in? And then what is the economics behind it, once those, what's the timing? And then when they start actually producing, what is the argument for them?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a hard one. There's a lot of data out there for, tree species A and crop B and then a different one, but we don't have every possible combination,
Mhm.
that's come out of some research site somewhere. So a lot of it, we don't know exactly how it'll work, but in general, in central Illinois, when we're dealing with, massive 60-foot combines kind of thing, we're often doing, 60-foot alleys or 30-foot combines, maybe 60-foot sprayers or 60-foot planters. So we'll do 2 passes of a combine. So that's a 60-foot alley. And then you got a little space for the tree rows, another 60-foot alley for the crops. So when you do something like that, you're only taking out maybe 5-10% of a field to get the trees established. So it's not a huge hit on total acres that are currently in row crops, but you're getting a tree established that's going to be a big revenue producer years from now. But then as that tree grows, eventually it will have an impact on the crop yields. And again, that depends on the crop, depends on the tree species. But what we generally say is you're starting with summer annuals. Corn and beans in a crop field is the most common. As the tree grows, let's say a decade in, it's not like you can just not grow crops anymore. You just need to think about what that combination and complementarity is. And usually people are switching to winter annuals, things like oats or winter wheat, and things that, for some species, like in France, they do a lot of winter wheat and black walnut. And so by the time the wheat is harvested, the black walnut is just starting to leaf out. It was a really late starter in the spring. And so even though you're using the same acreage, they almost never see each other seasonality wise. And so it's really great complementarity there. So yeah, usually you shift to winter annuals, and then ultimately, in my mind, I see all alley cropping systems as ultimately destined for silvopasture. Once you get to that really nice canopy and it's not really feasible to grow crops anymore, you plant pasture, you thin accordingly to get you the right dappled shade you want, and you end up at silvopasture.
What type of grants are you guys working with that helps that funding on the front end?
Yeah. Depends on the practice. So for things like riparian buffers and windbreaks, those more edge practices, now we do most of that through CRP, Conservation Reserve Program, which is run through USDA. The funding right now for that is really great, oftentimes up to like 80% cost share on all the establishment costs. And then, of course, the really great thing about CRP is that it pays the landowner or the farmer an annual rental payment at a pretty competitive rate. For other practices, which are not covered by CRP, like silvopasture or alley cropping, then there's other programs like EQIP or RCPP, or the new kind of PCSC funding, and the Climate Smart Commodities grant that's kind of going around the country. Those are all great for kind of upfront cost share, and they're more flexible in the kinds of things that you can do. The rules are less strict, but they don't provide the annual rental payment. So they just provide some sort of upfront cost share, but nothing ongoing, which in some cases is fine. But for a lot of more absentee landowners, they really want to see that rent coming in every year.
One thing I'm disappointed with, I did an NRCS grant. Maybe this has changed. But those grants that help people transition conventional cropland into grazing don't allow for these systems to be set up, which makes no sense.
Yeah.
Is that still the same case?
Yeah.
And honestly, now when I say that out loud, I did plant a row of trees in that pasture. I don't know, because we have one side of the farm is not.
Now you're on.
Yeah, now I'm on recording. One side of the farm is I didn't let NRCS. I essentially like broke it into threes, and I was like, all right, well, we'll just do it on a third of the ground. So the section that we planted most of the trees is not anything involved with that. But how is it dealing with these government programs when just some of this stuff, like you would think that the same group that's helping you fund in the CRP area would then also be willing to just fund that same practice in the grazing practices. Like what is it like? I mean, who's making these decisions, and how do we insert common sense?
Yeah, it is hard. That is, I mean, a big part of the design process and the value that Canopy provides to our clients is navigating all of that.
Yeah.
Because what's hard about it is it's not just that, it's a lot of paperwork and whatnot, but every individual farmer or landowner it's like they're reinventing the wheel, having to learn all of that from scratch themselves if they're doing it on their own. So part of what we do is we make sure that we've done enough of these where we know that the design fits within the parameters of whatever program that is at hand, and we can help navigate the paperwork, and we just know all the kind of pitfalls and whatnot. So that's a really valuable part of what we offer, and I think that it is really helping the adoption rates, basically utilization of these programs. Having an experienced consultant hold your hand and walk people through that process. But yeah, it's hard. I mean, there are some really great people at the USDA working to make change,
Yeah.
for sure. I mean, the USDA, just like uh, most government agencies, underfunded, understaffed, everyone's stressed, especially at the really local kind of county office level. A lot of staff turnover, people are moving around. So it's a hard environment to work in, but and you have to keep in mind that like most of these programs were not built originally for the innovative stuff we're trying to do now. We've learned a lot, but they have these really rigid rules. So yeah, there's a lot of work to do to remove the rigidity from some of these programs, but there are some really cool creative things that we can do within the existing programs. And it's really a matter of just education of the NRCS and FSA employees to show them, hey, look, over here in Iowa, we figured out how to do this within your program requirements. Can we try that now in Illinois? And like, you got to get one pilot project and they learn, they get excited, and then they can, spread it to other farms. So it's slow and painful, but the government funding is a really important part of the whole equation here.
Yeah. We had a really, really interesting meeting this week with a company that is working on, they're called biodiversity credits, and they're working on essentially brokering deals where if you have done these, carbon positive practices on your farm, that you can actually sell what's called a biodiversity credit uh, to corporations that say like Walmart puts in a new big headquarters, and there's a giant, like, they took out 10 acres of grassland, where they then would go buy a biodiversity credit to offset the impact that they did. Where then, so the future of that would look like,
Yeah.
I think we've heard it a lot in this industry for a few years, like, at some point we're gonna get paid for carbon credits. But it seems like we this was the first time I ever talked to someone that actually, it sounds like it's actually happening.
Yeah.
What have you seen in that realm? And obviously you guys are positioned really well if that ever takes off. But that, it's kind of like a, oh, hope, wish, thought type of deal, where if you do these practices down the road, someday maybe you'll be paid this money. Um, it's a cool idea, but what have you guys seen in that world?
Yeah. There is a lot going on. There are a lot of different players. It's overwhelming, quite frankly, because there's so many different players, and it's sometimes hard to parse the legitimacy of some players, especially from the side of people that are buying these credits. Like, are these projects actually happening? And we've seen a lot of news over the last couple of years of some scamminess getting involved in this industry, and it's disheartening because it makes everyone look bad. Um, but yeah, I mean, we generally kind of keep our ears to the ground on these things, but there's just not enough happening making a big enough difference to really turn the tide on what we can kind of pitch a client on. So for us, we want to make sure that the project makes sense, the design makes sense, the project makes sense economically without any of that, any credits for carbon or biodiversity or
Yeah.
anything happening. And if those come through, if that works out, that's just kind of icing on the cake.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess we probably should have mentioned it earlier, but these systems are actually conventional corn bean farmers that are using chemicals. These still work, right? These trees are not. They won't have issues with chemicals around them.
Yeah, so there's some caveats there. So yeah, we do alley cropping, for example, with conventional row crops. but there are some restrictions we have to place on what a farmer can spray. So, it- which is mainly the really volatile things like dicamba, 2,4-D that can drift and are targeted towards broadleaves like trees. But so farmers, if they're using those chemicals, may have to kind of change their chemical regime a bit, but it's not complete kibosh on
Yeah.
chemicals. So more innocuous things like Roundup or the whole kind of set of pre-emergence herbicides that kill weed seeds rather than the plants themselves don't really impact the trees that much, and so it's fine. So it's a little bit of a conversation and education with the farmer, but it's important for us to know how to integrate trees even into those conventional contexts, because we want these to be
Yeah,
everywhere.
absolutely. Absolutely. What's one of the most rewarding projects that you've been on? And, kinda give a little bit of an example of where they started and, why they came to you and, what you've been able to accomplish with them.
Yeah. Well, I really enjoy when there are multiple generations involved in a project. Um, we see that a lot. We see a lot of, the older generations who are kind of controlling the farm or the land right now are, looking towards, how do I keep my kids interested? How do I get the grandkids interested? Um, but whenever that happens, I think it makes for the best story, and is really great to see how different generations are kind of approaching the project and what their goals might be. Because some generations might prefer, like, they really care about what's the economic base of the farm going to be moving forward. Some just want the biodiversity and the beauty. Some want, hunting habitat. Um, but yeah, so there's several stories like that where it's really cool, especially on planting day. If you have three generations come out, and even once we had four, although the fourth one was just kind of, not very helpful. They're just kind of sitting in
Stroller.
a bassinet kind of thing.
Yeah.
But having four generations out on a planting day and like getting involved in putting those trees in the ground, and then all of them being able to watch that and have that common thread, that common story. I just think that's really great.
Yeah, that's amazing. Um, what else could we talk about for your new launch of the Canopy Compass? That is there anything do you wanna give a demo on video? I know it wouldn't be great for the people that are just listening in audio, but this will also be on YouTube, so we could you could share your screen and give, a quick demo if that's something that you wanna do, or if there's anything else you wanna talk about with, um, the software that, we can push people towards you.
Yeah. I mean, I think that just general intro was good. We've got some demos we've already recorded, so I think we can,
Good.
link people to that would be fine. Um, I think just kind of, we're just trying to plant this seed in different places.
Yeah.
I think we're doing a write up too, kind of
Yeah.
in parallel to this. Maybe we can have some more, visuals and links to that kind of stuff on there. But, I think that was great.
Yeah, and I think, you guys will be down in Madison, not very far away from you, this December for our conference, so anybody that ends up coming to our conference and trade show, make sure to look for the Canopy booth, and, I find that that's usually one of the best areas for people to, ask their questions. And how do you guys
Yeah.
usually handle a trade show setting? I'm sure, get a lot of folks that come up to you and ask you what you're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Carolyn is our point person on events and shows and everything. She's an amazing people person, and just all this stuff just starts with a conversation. People want to talk about their farm, tell you about the history of their farm. People are usually coming to Canopy with some goal, something they're trying to accomplish, and this vision they have, but they don't know how to fit trees into that. And
Yeah.
so there's just a lot of conversation to have about what the options are.
Awesome. Well, what's the best way for people to get in touch with, you or your team at Canopy? And, let's just give you guys a quick, shout out where to send people.
Yeah. Yeah, well, best place is our website, Canopy FM, like the radio, but actually for farmmanagement.com.
Um,
Uh, and then, but best place to start if you're interested in tree crops or agroforestry practices or anything in between is go to canopycompass.com and map your farm, create a report. And from there, you can click a button there to get in touch with us. And then we'll have the whole packet right in front of us, and we can have a good conversation about your farm with all that great data already in front of us.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing offer for people to go in there and get all of that data spit back at them. That's awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else, Kevin, that you think would be important for our listeners to know about you or Canopy? Actually, I do have one more question.
Yeah.
So we just we were just down at Gary Zimmer's yesterday recording the next podcast with him, and he talked about in the podcast Savannah Institute's new established planting. I think you guys had started you planted a field of his or something that he used to manage, and are you guys
Yeah. I'm not sure
did you,
exactly which one he's referring
well,
to, but
do you have
there's a
lots
lot
of
going
them?
on in
Well, he was
spring.
talking about it being underwater because of how much rain we've had.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. Well,
so what have been
there's,
some of the challenges this year with how much rain we've had? And is
yeah,
that
it's
are
been
you
a mess.
concerned about those trees? You know, or we think they'll
Uh,
be all right?
yeah, well, the place where he's probably referring to is part of our nursery, and it's actually where we have mother plants of like willow and poplar. So we knew that was going to be a flooded area,
Oh
so
yeah,
it
so
kind of
it'll be
worked out.
fine.
Yeah. But you don't. It's hard to get it managed when things are flooded,
Yeah,
But you still, if you've done your homework right, you know where the water is going to go, and you know what the soil and the water table are doing. You can plan accordingly and put the right things in there that'll like it. But yeah, I mean, this spring was just hard everywhere for tree planting in our nursery. You just couldn't get into a field. And
yeah,
so, usually in tree planting season, we've got crews that are kind of independent, and they're just bouncing around, avoiding the rain, so sometimes you don't know what order jobs are going to be planted in. You're just going to go wherever there's a dry field. And this year was kind of quite the logistical nightmare making that happen. So it's stunk, but we have to get used to it because this is the new climate reality. And so we have to
yeah.
be able to deal with that if we're going to get trees in the ground.
Would you take this year or last year?
From a tree planting perspective, last year,
Even with the
100%.
first year being such a bad drought?
Yeah. What we want is drought in April and May, and then lots of rain in June and July. That's the
I don't think
perfect
that
tree
usually that
establishment year.
it's not how it usually works.
That is not how it works. No.
Well, farming's always a challenge in some ways. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
All right, Kevin.
Yep.
Well, it's been a great episode. We appreciate you and Canopy, and we're looking forward to working with you guys a lot more in the future.
Awesome. Thanks, Taylor. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Acres USA podcast, a podcast production of Acres USA. Find us on Spotify, Apple, Google Play, and other popular podcast platforms. Acres USA is North America's oldest publisher on production-scale organic and regenerative farming. For more than 50 years, our mission has been to help farmers, ranchers, and market gardeners grow food profitably, regeneratively, and with nature in mind. Find our books and other Acres USA media and learn about Acres USA events at acresusa.com. Read our online magazine at members.acresusa.com, and we'd like to thank Acres USA staff for their contributions to producing this podcast. This episode was edited and engineered by Kennedy Stroessel and Weston Larson of Acres USA. And we're grateful to our guests for taking the time to talk with us about their experiences.